Energy Media readers, today we're going to be following up on musings by Premier Jason Kenney about maybe maybe the Alberta government would look at forming a Crown Corporation or government agency to invest in oil and gas projects. And so I've asked Harry Redenberg, who's Suncor Chair of Energy, professor at Haskayne School of Business, to join me today to discuss this. Welcome to the interview, Harry.
Thank you.
Now, what do you think of the, offhand remarks that the Premier made at a press conference?
Well, I think they're exactly what you just suggested. They're offhand. I think the Premier was kidding. No, maybe not kidding, but I don't think he was serious. This is not a serious, thought-out policy, I don't believe. First of all, I believe that the Conservative Party in Alberta and Premier Kenney are free market kind of folks, and going into government ownership of oil production is not exactly aligned with that kind of philosophy. Secondly, the literature in economics is almost unanimously behind that it's not a good idea for governments to get into these kinds of things. Business is better done by business, and the role of government is to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, that the investment climate is a positive one, and then leave business to do what it does.
Now, let me lay out a scenario where we could plausibly see Premier Kenney actually contemplating this. And that's because the oil and gas sector, not the big players, not the Suncors and Imperials and so on, but the juniors. The juniors are suffering a severe capital crisis. They can't borrow money from the banks. Nobody, private equity will not invest in them. Public offerings have almost dried up over the last 2 years. They either have gone bankrupt or they're on the verge of going bankrupt. This is an underreported but very serious problem. And I could see the Premier, saying, well, hey, maybe we need to help out some of these guys because, they also support companies, service sector companies and so on out in rural Alberta, which is his base. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think it certainly could be tempting, and there are many premiers before him who have been tempted to do the same thing. And that's the other thing. Alberta has a long history of doing exactly that sort of thing, getting into various businesses from airlines to other things, and they haven't turned out particularly well. So it's probably not a good idea. And as to the Premier and the government's time and effort spent, it would be far better spent on what a government should be doing, is ensuring that the environment, the investment environment in Canada, not just in Alberta, but in Canada, is a more positive one. Because the reason that it's difficult for these companies to raise money is because of the political climate here.
So Harry, if you were an advisor to Premier Kenney, what would be 2 solid pieces of advice that you would give him to improve the investment climate in Alberta?
2, well, I can think of one write-off, and the one write-off is, and I see there's a meeting already set up on March 13th between the premiers and the Prime Minister. Premier Kenney and Prime Minister Trudeau need to get together and not come out of a room until they've come up with something around a solid climate policy. The longer that Canada fights, on the one hand, we have a so-called very progressive federal government in Ottawa saying, we've got Paris Agreement, we've got our commitments, and we're going to move forward at a breakneck speed. And we've got Alberta saying we're fighting carbon tax, we're fighting every bit of carbon policy. And a good part of Mr. Kenney's base is still arguing about whether climate change is even happening. We're past that. It doesn't matter whether it's happening or not. World financial markets believe it's happening and that we need to do something about it. And the reason we can't get investment dollars is because we have this bickering between the different governments.
Harry, I could not agree with you more, but let me point out a contradiction or an irony in your comment, which is that the federal government has robust, progressive climate policy that it's moving ahead with, and Alberta is basically the renegade in this scenario. And so when I look at this, I don't see Canada has to get its act together. I see the UCP government has to get its act together.
I think they both need to. I think Canada needs to recognize that there are jobs in Alberta, there are companies in Alberta that need to keep people working, and we need to keep revenues coming in. The federal government needs to recognize that the the hydrocarbon industry and the refined petroleum industry is still the largest export industry of this country. It's close to $100 billion US per year industry. The auto industry is just slightly over half of that. This is Canada's most important industry. And yes, we need to move forward on climate change initiatives, but we have to do it in a responsible sort of manner that preserves jobs and it keeps people working and keeps revenues coming in. Alberta, on the other hand, has to recognize that the longer Alberta fights about whether climate change is happening or whether we're in an energy transition or not, all that just plays out on the international stage as Canada hasn't got its stuff together.
Harry, you and I share that view, and I know Energy Media will continue banging the drum for Alberta to get its act together. Thank you very much for this. I always enjoy interviewing you, and we will look forward to our next chat.
Thank you very much, Markham. Talk soon. Bye-bye.